Hello there all my lovely jewelry makers, I'm Christina of CSLdesigns, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this intertwining wire macrame bracelet. Now we make this really cool intertwining effect while we're making the macrame itself and adding our beads in. And of course I'll show you how to do that, but if you particularly like any of the bracelets that I'm showing in the video, they will be available for sale in my shop as well. You can find them underneath the video and in the description box. And this design is also very versatile, so you can really play around with it and achieve different looks, depending on your personal taste. So if you want to learn how you can make these pieces, then keep watching. So these are the materials that we'll need. Now I'm using a regular round silver coated copper wire, and the first gauge here is a 0.8mm. This will be our holding wire. And then for the working wire, we'll need a 0.5mm. Now you can play around with the gauges and use some different sizes, for instance a 0.4mm instead of a 0.5mm or a 1mm instead of a 0.8mm, but you will just get slightly different results. As for the beads, in this case I'm using 3 different sizes just to get a nice graduated result. So that would be 6mm, 8mm and 10mm rounds, but you can really use whatever size you prefer. Regardless what size you're using though, just make sure that 2 lengths of your working wire can go through the holes in your beads. And of course we then need our clasp as well, so I've got a lock stock claw clasp and extended chain and a couple of jump rings to put it all together. You can use whatever kind of clasp you prefer or even make your own. Now I'm going to be working on this mini macrame board. It has these notches all the way around the edges that makes it easy to take our wires in and out whenever we need to. And then as for pliers, of course we'll need some flush cutters so we can cut our wire, some chain nails and tweezer nose pliers to help manipulate the wire and for the jump rings. And finally, I'm going to use these 6-step bell making pliers for any loops we need to make. You can also use round nose pliers for this. Now, like always, you can find the full tool and material list in the description box down below, along with useful links. Otherwise, let's get it all ready and let's get started. Now, the lengths of wires we'll need to cut is first of all 2 lengths of our holding wire, so the 0.8mm in this case, of about 40 centimeters each. And just make sure that they're smoothed out, no kinks or bends in them. And then we'll need 4 lengths of our working wires, so the thinner gauge, of about 1 meter and 20 centimeters each, and again make sure there's no kinks or bends in them. So the first thing we need to do is set up our board, so I'm going to grab my 2 holding wires, and I'm just going to make sure they're even on one end, and then put them through just the same slot here, on the short end of my board, and then just have some tails left that I'm just bending towards the back, and then they're coming down towards the other end, so the other short end here. And then I'm going to grab the working wires, so all 4 of them. Again, just make sure the ends are roughly even. And I'm going to put them on the top side here through the same slot. Just leave short little tails again. And I'm just kind of securing them in the back a little bit so they don't pull straight through. Now what we're going to do is just separate the wires out a little bit. So I'm going to take 2 of these wires and separate them out and have one go towards one side and then just have another go towards the other side. Now the remaining 2 I'm going to bring in with the holding wires, and I'm going to try and make sure that the working wires here are in the middle, so in between the 2 holding wires. And then I'm going to bring these 4 to the bottom of my board and then just place them into the opposite slot to the top, and then again bend them around the back. And this is how our board is going to be set up with our wires to begin with. So the first thing we're going to do is start out making one end, and we're going to work our way all the way to the other end, of course making our design in the middle. So just to show you on what I've already done, what we're going to be doing is just this little section first of all, before we then split our wires up and start working on this intertwining design. So I'm literally just going to use our 2 working wires that we separated out, 1 on each side, and make square knots around all these 4 in the middle. So grab one length, it doesn't matter what side you start with. I'm just going to take my left one, put that over all the holding wires, then the right one goes over that, underneath everything in the middle, and make sure that you catch all the wires there in the middle, and then up through the loop here on the other side, and then pull it all the way through, nice and gentle. And we then just grab onto both ends and start to pull this nice and tight. And I just like to make sure that the 2 working wires here that are currently holding wires but will be working wires throughout the main part are still in the middle, and then pull that nice and tight. Now to complete our first square knot, I'm going to take the other side first, bring that over, and then the left one in this case over that, underneath everything in the middle and up through the loop. And then tightening this underneath the first half will complete our first square knot. Now if you're not too familiar with macrame knots, I do have a basic beginner video tutorial. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below and probably somewhere on the screen. Otherwise, you want to just make a couple of these knots underneath each other. Now I tend to make about 3. I find that's a nice amount, but of course it's completely up to you. So now I have my 3 knots in place. We need to start separating our wires out, so you can release all of these wires in the middle from the slot on the bottom, and then we just need to kind of separate them to each side. Now we need to have a holding wire, so one of the thicker gauges on either side and one of the thinner gauges, which will now start being working wires again. Now you can just right underneath that final knot just push these holding wires a little bit against, so they come out at more of an angle. You can see almost 90 degrees from each other from that knot, and you can place them back down in some slots on the bottom just to keep them in place while we do the next part. Now we're then going to work on one side at a time and start working our way down to where we're actually going to start the main part of the pattern. So doesn't matter what side you start on, I'm just going to start on the left because that's what I naturally do for some reason. And then I'm literally going to be focusing on one side at a time. So these 3 wires here belong to the left, and these 3 wires belong to the right for now. So I'm literally just going to make a couple of square knots around each of these holding wires with the working wires from that same group. So I'm starting with the outer one, bringing that over, and then the inner one here comes over that underneath everything in the middle and up through the loop on the other side. So literally same basic square knot. Just pull it all the way through, and now tighten this as far up as it'll go to sit right there, and then obviously finish off this knot in the same way so we get a full complete knot. So just starting with the opposite side and otherwise repeating. And this is then one full square knot. Now we are currently then working on this section here where we're going from that separation area down to where we're then going to add our first bead. So this might be different depending on the materials that you use and the size beads especially. So you're going to have to figure out how many knots that you need to make. So we basically need to get both of the sides to the point where we need to add our first bead. So you can have your bead handy. Like I'm going to have mine here, and then basically as I'm making my knots, I'm going to keep referencing the bead and bring it in and kind of compare where it's going to end up sitting and see when I reach just onto the side of the bead. So like I said, the amount of knots you're going to need will depend on some variables. But you otherwise just keep making these square knots until you create a bit of a row here. Like I said, until where the bead is going to be added. Now I'd rather keep checking and make too few and have to make an extra here and there rather than make too many, because it's wire we're working with. You can't really undo it as easily as if it's cord, because if you do, you're going to get kind of damage to the wire and have it be far more likely to break, which of course we want to try and avoid. So rather, like I said, make too few and then keep checking than making too many. Now we of course need to just go to the other side as well and make our knots on this side equivalent to the first side here. So in this case, what I like to do personally is start from the opposite side. So on the left, I'm starting my knots with the left wire, so the outer wire, and on the right, I'm also starting with the outer wire, which is the right wire. So that's just personal preference. That way it becomes more symmetrical looking. But start making your knots on this side as well, just like we did on the other side. So the first one here, we're going to pull up as tight as we can go, so we get that nice separation from the first few knots that we made. And again, just make the same amount as you did on the other side until we get to that point where we're going to add in our first bead. So I've got the same amount of knots on both sides now, and I'm just going to check against the first bead that I'm going to add in, just placing it there between, and see if I feel like it's in a good place to actually add it in, and I think that's pretty good. Now what I've ended up with is 3 knots and a half on either side. Now the reason that I'm doing the half is because if you look closely at your knots, you'll find on one side of a single knot you have a little loop kind of that goes over the working wire, which then comes out underneath it, and then on the other side of the same knot the wire comes out more at the top of the knot. So what that means is on one side you'll have a little loop, and I personally prefer that side to be in towards where the bead is, so basically right next to the bead once I add them in. So that's why I made an extra half of a knot to get the last knot there in that position. It's not a big deal, it's just a personal preference, so it's up to you. But otherwise, to add in the bead, I'm going to grab the 2 inner working wires here, so the thinner gauges that are naturally going in towards each other and kind of look like they want to cross over there. So what we're going to do is let them cross, but they're going to cross inside of the bead. So take one at a time, add your bead on one of the wires, and then I like to just let it drop down a bit first, and then take the other length here, again is the 2 inner ones, and then go through the same bead but in the opposite direction, which then makes the wires cross inside of the bead, and then just gently pull it all the way through. Be careful not to strip the wire as you're pulling it through the bead there. Now as we're getting further down, I like to kind of push the bead pretty much all the way down on one of the lengths, and then I hold it in place there while I then bring the rest of the other length through, because you want to avoid getting any kinks here, and it kind of naturally wants to form a kink right here on the other side, that last little bit of wire that we need to get through. So just work against that and make sure we don't let it create a kink, but we pull it all the way through until the bead sits right up against our knots there, nice and tight in between them. And then our inner wires, our inner working wires, have swapped place now as well, so they're crossing inside the bead and are coming out to the opposite side, but they're still just going to be doing the same thing, now just on the opposite side to where they were before. And that is how we're going to be adding in our beads. Now after this, we basically just need to pick back up our macrame knots. The first thing I'm going to do is the holding wires here, you don't want to have them so far out from each other anymore. You want to bring them back in so they kind of now just come straight down, still in separate slots, but just bring them back a little bit closer together, something like this, because obviously we don't want to keep making our knots going further and further out. So what we do want to do though is continue making our knots as if we never stopped, now just after we added in that bead, and we now need to make a long enough section to then, on both sides of course, be able to cross our sections over and then get to the point of adding in the next bead. So let's just start making our knots first of all. Now because the last knot we made was half of one, that means that that little loop on our knot is on the inside, and it's also a good idea to use how your knot looks as a reference to the next wire you need to start with. So basically I know that every time I'm picking up my wires to make a new knot, I need to start with the wire that comes from underneath that little loop. That means I need to start with the inner one. So I'll bring that over first, because basically we now need to complete the knot that we started out before we added in the bead, which then creates a full knot. So I take the inner one over first, and then the outer one comes over that, and underneath everything in the middle and up through the loop here on the other side. And then what you'll find is tightening these knots here, it's going to be a little bit more tricky because the bead is going to be a little bit in the way. So what I like to do is the wire that's coming from the bead, I pull that up to basically go straight out all the way to the side, and the other length is now coming through right up above that in the little gap, and then it's in this position where I start to pull this. I keep the other one tight and I just pull this tighter all the way down to a point where you can see that little loop being created on now the outside of the knot, and then I bring it down over the other wire, and now I'm ready to make the next knot. And it's just a way to bring the wires around the bead and still get the best looking knots. And now of course we need to start with, if you just look at the knot you just made, that little loop where your wire then comes out under it is on the outside. So I'm starting with that length, and then otherwise just completing my knot. And it's still a little bit tricky because the bead is still a bit in the way. So I like to kind of, this wire that's actually fighting with the bead right now, kind of bring it up and over the bead and flat as far down as it'll go on top of the other knots above, and then pull the two sides tight at the same time, as tight as it'll go, and then bring it down and into position. And it tends to give the best result, I find. You can also always just use pliers to push the knots a little bit into just the right place if you want to. But otherwise, we just literally keep making knots like this. And again, how many you need all depends on the materials that you're using, and obviously also how you like it to look. But we need to make a row of knots that's long enough, like I said, for the two sides to cross, and then hit the point where we need to add the next bead. Now of course, like before, we just want to also do everything that we just done on one side on the other side as well. Remember, if you're doing the same as me with the knots, you want to start with the inside, but just make sure you're starting with the side that you're due to use next. And then I bring this one coming from the bead straight out first of all, and then pull the other one tight and bring that down. Like I said, it's just to work around the bead and try and get the best result possible. But then I'm going to make the same amount of knots on this side here, so we get both sides even. So I now have 8.5 knots on the inside here by just counting those little loops on the edges of the knots. And what I'm going to do is check if this is the correct amount. So for now I'm using the same size bead. So I'm just going to release the holding wires from the bottom here because we need to cross our sections. So I'm just going to kind of keep holding them together, all the lengths of wires from each group. Now I'm going to take one length here underneath the other. It doesn't matter which side goes under and which side goes over, as long as you stay consistent, if that's the look you're going for, of course. And then I'm going to cross them, and then they start to curve further around the bead there up top. So I'm going to basically get them into a position where I'm happy with how that looks. And then on the bottom here, we can just bring all the wires with us because they've now swapped sides. So the bottom part of this, we want to start curving inwards again. So I like to kind of grab hold of the holding wire there, so the thicker gauge, and then kind of push against it at the same time, bringing it in towards the middle, so it creates a bit of a curve like that. I'm just going to do the same on the other side. So I'm just getting these sections into position so I can then bring my bead in and see if I'm happy with how everything is, or if I need to make some more knots. So I'm then just going to bring my bead in that I'm going to add to the piece next and see how I feel, if it's going to look nice or if I need to add any more knots or anything, because obviously it really depends how you want it to look as well, but you want it to look as even as possible. So something a bit like that. I want it to look as similar to the top one as possible. So I actually think this is pretty good. So I happen to hit the right amount of knots. So of course I can just bring the holding wires, so those thick gauges, back down to slots on the bottom, because we also already added that curve in, so we're ready to just start making knots after we've added the bead in, of course. Now of course, if you do this, measure against the bead and decide that it doesn't seem like quite enough, you can always just add some more knots here on either side. Just remember to keep an eye on where your wires are coming out from the previous knot, so you make sure to start from the correct side so you keep the look consistent throughout. But otherwise, if we want to add our bead in, we literally do that in the same way as the first one. We take the two inner lengths of working wires and just grab one at a time, add the bead on one length, drop it down a bit, and then add the other length of wire through the same bead but in the opposite direction, and then gently start to pull the lengths all the way through. This is also really the true test once you add the bead to see how it actually looks, if I was correct or not. And then you can obviously fully see there if you're happy with it. If you're not, you can always remove the bead again. Just do it gently to try and make sure to not damage the wire too much if you can help it. But also just a note again regarding the knots, this is just my personal preference. Like I mentioned in the first one, I like that side of my knot that has the loop over the top of the working wire to be against the bead, so I make sure to finish with my last knot there so it sits like that once I've crossed them over. Of course you can always add an extra half of a knot or something if you need to get it into that position, if you're bothered about that. But otherwise, I've added my bead. I need to start making knots again, and I'm starting with the side where technically the wire is coming underneath that loop, but it's just going through the bead to the other side where it's the same principle. They've just replaced each other, you could say. And this is the beginning where the bead is a little bit in the way. So I kind of position my wires straight out to the side, the one that's coming through the bead, and then I pull the other one tight. And then I can make the other half. Again, just maneuvering around the bead however I have to. And just like before, if you need to, you can just push anything into position with your pliers. You can get a lot more precise with that than you can with, say, your nails or something. Now, of course, it's up to you and what you do for your design. In this case, I am using different size beads throughout. So in that case, every time I'm adding in a new size, I'll have to kind of work out how many knots I have to make between the beads again. So if I'm adding a bigger bead, I will have to add some more knots to kind of accommodate for that extra size. But the good thing is, if you're only using the same size bead throughout, you now know how many knots you need to put between the beads. So you can literally just do that on both sides every time and then cross them and add your bead, because obviously you'll be able to just repeat that since there's no change in sizing throughout. But that's obviously completely up to you and the look that you're going for. But I'm just going to then keep making knots, and like I said, for now, as long as it's the same size bead, I'm just going to make the same amount as I did before. Whereas once I start adding in the larger beads, of course I'm going to change the amount, and the same when I then start going back down in size. But then you just want to keep going like this throughout, however you want to make your design. Make the length that you need for your bracelet, of course minus the clasp, so whatever length that's going to take up, you want to make sure you include that in the total length. But then once you get to the other end of the main part of the design here, I'll show you where we go from then. So I've now reached the length of my bracelet, and like I mentioned, the amount of knots you need between your beads will be different depending on what materials you're using, your tension, so several factors. But in case you're interested in what I've ended up with, what I have here is between the small beads I have 8.5 knots, and between a small and then the next step up I have 9.5. And between the middle size bead and the large one I have 10.5 knots. And then of course on the other side we just go down in the mirrored image. And because I've already made the amount of knots I need on the other side, I already knew on this side here how many I needed to make for these sections. So to then finish off the bracelet on this end here, we now are in a position where we need to bring our wires together again, because we want to mirror the other end so they look the same. Now what I've ended up with is just a few knots after my very last bead, and you just want to make sure to make the same amount as we did on the other end before the last bead. And in my case that's 3 knots here on the inside, and in total it's 3.5. But of course again that might be different depending on the materials and tension. But then what I'm going to do is just release my 2 holding wires there, and then for these last 2 sections I want to then just start bringing them in towards each other. So just push them, adding a curve, but then also again make sure to bring this holding wire straight down, and then the same with the one on the other side. So bring them in towards each other so you can see the ends of the knotted sections there. They start to meet up, but then hold that in place and bring the wire then straight down. Now I'm going to just place them into the same slot on the bottom, and also the two inner working wires there I'm going to take and place into that same slot as well. And again, I'm going to make sure as I make knots around all these that the two working wires ideally stay in between the two working wires, so in the middle of them. But then I'm just going to pick up my outer working wire here on either side, and just like we did in the beginning, make a few square knots around all these. Make sure that you catch all of them like that, and then pull it tight, as tight as you can get it here at the top. And I always like to just take my working wires and kind of push against that knot and just pull them down a little bit. It helps settle everything in place. But otherwise, then keep making knots. And like I said, we just want to make the same amount as the other end to keep it nice and even. And for me, that's 3 knots. And once we've done that, we are done with our macrame, and we can remove our piece from the macrame board, and then we just basically need to finish everything off. So to finish off the ends, I'm just going to show you on one because it's the same on both. But what we're going to do is first of all get rid of some of our working wires here. So the two that are coming out from that last knot in between the two holding wires, so the thicker gauge, I'm going to just cut off first. So don't worry about it coming undone because they are going through several knots and they're also being used throughout the bracelet. So I'm going to literally take my cutters, and if you need to pull them out a little bit to be able to get in there, then just do that, and then put my cutters as far down as they'll go, and then literally just cut off the excess length, just like that. You can always then just, if there's a little end left, just push that in. And then I'm going to get rid of the two working wires here. Now just have a little look at your very last knot and the position that your wires are coming out from in that knot. So this one here is coming out towards the side that we're on, and then this one on the other side is coming out more towards the opposite side because it has that little loop that it comes underneath. So you want to kind of keep them on the side that they're coming out to, and then start to bring it to the other side of the knot, and then go through that little loop. You should have a little gap, just like that, and then just pull it through. Now before I pull it all the way, I like to just do the other one as well. So flip it around and then take it from the side it's coming from, go towards the other side of the knot, and then just put the end through that little loop, and then we can pull them all the way through. Now just one at a time, pull it nice and tight, because what that does is it makes these working wires basically wrap around the holding wires within the knot, and that helps secure them. I'm going to then just bring them over again, but this time not go through that loop, just literally lay them towards the other side, and then go in and cut off the excess. And I like to cut them off basically just where the knot ends. Cut both of them off like that, and then make sure to grab your pliers and then just grab onto the very end of the wire that's left, so you can feel it with your fingers and you can also just see it sticking out there. So I just grab to the very end, and I like to put a little bend into it, flick it with my wrist in towards the knot, and then you can push it down, and the very end of the wire will basically be tucked into the knot and not be out and sticking out to catch or scratch on any clothes or skin. So that is how we're going to securely finish them off. Same with the one on the other side, of course. Just do that little flick of the wrist, and then push it in to make sure we tuck it out of the way. And then just always just feel it, make sure you can't feel any ends of wire so it's comfortable. And then what we have left are our two holding wires here, so the two thicker gauges. So I'm going to use one of them to make a wrap loop with, and that means I'm going to take the other one, it doesn't matter which one because you can see they're right there next to each other, but take one of them and bend it down against the very last knot there, and then just start to wrap it around the other one tied up against the knot. So we're just wrapping it around the other one until you feel like it's going to be nice and secure, and then just leave it towards the back and then cut off the excess. And always make sure to just push down the end of the wire. Now we have one length left, and we're going to use that to make a wrap loop with. So grab onto it just a little bit above that wrap we just did with your pliers and put about a 90-degree bend into it. Then grab, I'm going to use my 6-step bill making pliers, you can use round nose pliers, whatever you have handy, and bring it all the way around to create a full circle that I'm then going to grip onto with my pliers so it keeps its shape, while I'm then taking the rest of the tail there and wrapping around below the circle, just filling in that little gap that we left. Keep wrapping until we don't have any more space and it meets up with the wrap that's already there. Now cut off the excess, and again just make sure to squeeze down that end so it's nice and comfortable. So like I said, literally do the same steps on the other end there, and you'll have your loops where you can just attach your findings. So to shape the bracelet, I'm just going to go in from one end and start putting a curve into it. Of course, make sure that the front here is facing outward, whichever side you prefer. And then just keep adding a gradual curve going back and forth. Now don't go into one place and just put a big bend, that'll put it out of shape. You can also put it around something that has a size and shape you want it to have, like a bracelet mandrel. But the aim is to just create a nice shape here and get the two ends closer together, so we can of course use the clasp. And then once we have that, you have your bracelet finished and ready to wear. So you end up with this cool bracelet that has a really interesting intertwining effect, and you can also play around with the design, for instance using different size materials to achieve some different looks and completely make it fit your personal style. So if you like wire macrame, I do have loads more tutorials on my channel along with other mediums as well. So you can feel free to check that out, and of course like, share and subscribe. And don't forget, these bracelets will be available for sale in my shop. You can find them underneath the video and in the description box. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.